For 8 years, the boy pressed his hand against his ear. Every specialist said the same thing. There's nothing we can do. His father spent millions, traveled to 3 continents, begged the world's best doctors to look one more time. They all shook their heads. Then a maid noticed something every expert had missed, and what she pulled out of that child's ear will leave you speechless. Damian Cross was a tech billionaire, Silicon Valley legend, penthouse suites, fortune that could buy small countries. But his son Victor was born deaf, 8 years old, never heard a single sound. Damian tried everything: Mayo Clinic, Berlin, Singapore. Specialists who charged $10,000 just to look at a scan. They ran tests, MRIs, genetic screenings. Every single one said the same thing: congenital, irreversible, learn to accept it. But Damian couldn't accept it, because Victor was all he had left. His wife, Elena, died 3 months after Victor was born. Postpartum complications, the doctors called it. Too sudden, too cruel. So Damian kept searching, kept paying, kept praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore. What he didn't know, the answer wasn't coming from a research hospital. It was coming from the woman he'd just hired to keep his marble floors spotless. Grace Okafor was a maid, 29, no medical degree, no credentials, just a woman trying to pay off her younger brother's hospital bills from a car accident that left him paralyzed. But she noticed something about Victor that every specialist had overlooked. Something wrong with how he touched his ear. Something that looked like pain, not just silence. And one afternoon, while Damian was in Manhattan closing a deal, she made a decision that would either save that boy's life or destroy her own. What happened next? You need to see it for yourself. The Cross estate wasn't a home. It was a fortress made of glass in silence. Damian had designed it himself, back when he still believed technology could solve anything. Smart glass that tinted automatically, floors heated to exactly 72 degrees, security systems that recognize faces, voices, even the way people walked. The house cost $47 million to build, and every tech magazine in the country had run features on it. They called it visionary. They called it the future of residential architecture. But none of them understood what it really was: a mausoleum, a place where sound went to die. After Elena passed, after the doctors told him Victor would never hear, Damian had made a decision. If his son lived in silence, then silence would be the language of their home. He fired the staff who spoke too loudly. He removed every television, every radio, every device that made unnecessary noise. He installed sound-dampening panels in the walls, carpeting so thick your footsteps disappeared into it. Even the appliances were specially ordered: refrigerators that didn't hum, dishwashers that ran silently, air conditioning systems engineered to be whisper quiet. The staff learned quickly, or they didn't last. Mrs. Brennan, the head housekeeper, enforced the rules with iron discipline. No raised voices, no music, not even through headphones while you worked. No laughter that carried down hallways. No slamming doors, no dropping objects, no sudden sounds of any kind. If you needed to communicate, you whispered or you texted. If you forgot, you were gone. There were 17 people employed at the estate: a housekeeper, 3 maids, 2 groundskeepers, a chef, a nutritionist, a private tutor, 2 security guards, 4 personal assistants who managed Damian's business affairs, and a full-time nurse who monitored Victor's health. Not one of them spoke above a whisper inside the house. Not one of them smiled. They moved through the glass corridors like shadows, present but not really there, watching but never engaging. Victor's world was even smaller. His bedroom occupied the entire 3rd floor, a massive space filled with every toy, every game, every educational tool money could buy. Tablets loaded with sign language apps, books in Braille even though he could see perfectly, building blocks, art supplies, a wall-mounted screen that plays videos with subtitles. Everything a deaf child might need, and nothing that would actually help him. Because Victor wasn't playing, he sat by the window most days, staring out at the manicured gardens he wasn't allowed to explore alone, his small hand pressed against his right ear. Always the right ear. Sometimes he'd press so hard his fingertips turned white. Sometimes he'd wince, his whole body tensing like something inside was hurting him. The nurse had mentioned it once to Damian. "Mr. Cross, Victor seems to be experiencing discomfort in his ear. Perhaps we should—" "The best doctors in the world have examined him," Damian had interrupted, his voice flat and final. "If there was something wrong, they would have found it." The nurse never mentioned it again. Damian rarely spent time with his son anymore. He couldn't bear it. Every time he looked at Victor, he saw Elena. The same dark hair, the same delicate features, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. But where Elena had been full of life and laughter, Victor was silent and still, a ghost of what might have been. So Damian buried himself in work. Board meetings, acquisitions, product launches. He'd built a tech empire worth $11 billion, and none of it mattered. He'd give every cent, every patent, every line of code to hear his son say one word. Just one. Dad. That's all he wanted, just to hear Victor call him Dad. But the doctors said it was impossible, and Damian Cross, who had built his fortune on making the impossible possible, had finally found a problem money couldn't solve. At least, that's what he thought. Until the day Grace Okafor walked into his home and refused to look away from what everyone else had been trained to ignore. Grace had been awake since 4 in the morning, her stomach twisting itself into knots. She'd ironed her only professional blouse 3 times, trying to smooth out wrinkles that kept reappearing like her anxiety made manifest. The bus ride from Queens to Westchester had taken 2 hours, and she'd spent every minute of it praying. Not the formal prayers from her childhood in Lagos, but desperate, whispered pleas. "Please, God, please let me get this job. Please let them see I'm good enough." She wasn't good enough, not on paper. Her resume was a patchwork of survival: hotel housekeeping, office cleaning, a brief stint at a hospital where she'd been let go for taking too many days off to care for David after the accident. No references that mattered, no degree, no skills beyond working hard and keeping her head down. But the agency had called her anyway, and Grace knew why. The Cross estate went through Maid's the way other people went through tissues. Nobody lasted. The pay was excellent, but something about the job made people quit within weeks. Grace couldn't afford to quit. She couldn't afford to fail. So when the security gate buzzed her through and she walked up that immaculate driveway, past fountains and sculptures that probably cost more than her entire apartment building, she told herself she would be different. She would be invisible. She would be perfect. Mrs. Brennan was waiting in the staff entrance, a clipboard in her hands and ice in her eyes. She looked Grace up and down like she was inspecting produce at a market and finding it subpar. "Grace Okafor, you're 10 minutes early." It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation, clinical and cold. "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to make sure I wasn't late. The agency said you need this position urgently. Financial difficulties." Mrs. Brennan made it sound like a character flaw. Grace's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "My brother was in an accident. I'm helping with his medical expenses." "I see. And you understand this is a live-out position? You'll work 6 days a week, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Your responsibilities include cleaning the main living areas, the guest wing, and Mr. Cross's office. You will not enter the 3rd floor. You will not enter Mr. Cross's private quarters. And most importantly," Mrs. Brennan leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something that was almost a threat, "you will not interact with the boy." Grace blinked. "The boy?" "Mr. Cross's son, Victor. He's 8 years old. He's deaf. He requires specialized care, which is not your concern. Your concern is keeping these floors clean and staying out of the way. The last 3 maids we hired thought they could help, thought they could befriend the child, thought they understood his needs better than the medical professionals Mr. Cross employs. Mrs. Brennan's smile was thin and humorless. They were all wrong, and they were all terminated. "I understand," Grace said quietly. "I'm just here to work." "Are you?" Mrs. Brennan studied her face, searching for something. Weakness, maybe, or defiance. "Because you strike me as the type who can't help herself, the type who sees a child and thinks with her heart instead of her head." Grace forced herself to meet the woman's gaze. "I think with my need to pay rent, ma'am, I can't afford to lose this job. You have my word. I'll do exactly what you ask. Nothing more." Mrs. Brennan held her stare for another long moment, then nodded curtly. "You start tomorrow, 6:50 a.m. sharp. Wear neutral colors. Flat shoes with soft soles. Keep your phone on silent. If I hear it ring even once, you're gone. If you speak above a whisper inside this house, you're gone. If you so much as look at that child longer than necessary—" "I'm gone," Grace finished. "I understand." "Good." Mrs. Brennan turned and began walking toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. This house has rules for a reason. Mr. Cross has been through unimaginable loss. His son is all he has left, and he protects that boy with everything he has. If you care about your brother's medical bills, you'll remember that. Stay invisible, Miss Okafor. It's the only way you'll survive here." Grace nodded, even though Mrs. Brennan had already turned away. As she walked back down that pristine driveway, past the glass walls and perfect hedges, she whispered another prayer. Not for the job anymore. She had that. Now she prayed for the strength to keep her promise, to stay invisible, to ignore whatever pain she might see. She had no idea how impossible that promise would become. Grace's first week at the Cross estate passed in a blur of marble floors and whispered instructions. She learned the rhythm of invisibility, how to move through rooms like smoke, how to clean without making a sound, how to become so unremarkable that people forgot she was there. Mrs. Brennan watched her constantly those first few days, waiting for her to slip up, to speak too loudly or linger too long in the wrong hallway. But Grace had been poor long enough to know how to disappear when survival depended on it. She saw Victor on her third day, just a glimpse through the glass walls that made the house feel like an aquarium. He was sitting in what must have been a playroom, surrounded by toys he wasn't touching, his hand pressed against his right ear. Grace looked away quickly, remembering Mrs. Brennan's warning. "Not your concern, stay invisible." But over the following days she kept seeing him, always in the same position, always touching that ear, and always, this was what made Grace's chest tighten, grimacing. It wasn't the blank expression of a child lost in thought. It was pain, small and constant, like a splinter working its way deeper. On her 9th day, Grace was polishing the glass panels near the playroom when Victor walked past, so close she could have reached out and touched him. His hand was pressed against his ear again, harder this time, and his face contorted in a wince that made him look much older than 8. He stopped walking, squeezed his eyes shut, and stood there trembling for almost 30 seconds before the moment passed. Grace's hand froze on the glass. That wasn't deafness. She'd grown up around deaf children in Lagos, her cousin's daughter, the boy who lived next door. They didn't touch their ears like that. They didn't grimace like something was stabbing them from the inside. That was distress, physical, acute, ongoing distress. She thought about the specialists, the millions spent, the best doctors in 3 continents. They'd all said nothing could be done. But had any of them watched Victor for more than an examination? Had any of them seen this daily ritual of pain? Grace returned to cleaning, but her mind wouldn't settle. She thought about David, lying in that hospital bed after the accident, how 3 doctors had said he'd never walk again before the 4th one noticed the misread X-ray. How sometimes the most expensive care wasn't the most careful care. That night, riding the bus back to Queens, Grace made a decision that terrified her. She would watch Victor more closely. Not interact, not interfere, just watch. Because if everyone else had missed something, if that child was suffering while the whole world insisted nothing was wrong, then maybe staying invisible meant becoming complicit in his pain. And Grace Okafor had already ignored too much suffering in her life to afford any more. It started with a puzzle. Victor had dropped it, a wooden jigsaw of the solar system, and pieces had scattered across the floor like planets spinning out of orbit. He was on his hands and knees, trying to gather them, but his right hand kept flying back to his ear. Grab a piece, wince, touch the ear. Grab another piece, grimace, press harder. Grace was supposed to be cleaning the adjoining hallway. She was supposed to keep moving, keep her eyes down, stay invisible. Mrs. Brennan was 2 floors below, doing inventory. The nurse was in the kitchen. No one would see. She knelt down and started collecting pieces. Victor's head snapped up, his eyes wide. For a moment, they just stared at each other. This woman who wasn't supposed to acknowledge him, and this boy who'd been trained to expect nothing from the shadows that cleaned his home. Then Grace smiled, just a little, and held out 3 puzzle pieces. He took them slowly, like he was afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. Grace picked up the rest and set them on the table beside him. She should have left then, should have returned to her cart and her cleaning solution and her carefully maintained invisibility. Instead, she picked up the corner piece, Saturn with its rings, and placed it where it belonged. Victor watched her hands. Then hesitantly he added Jupiter. They finished the puzzle in silence. When the last piece clicked into place, Victor looked up at her with something that might have been gratitude or might have been confusion. Grace pressed her finger to her lips, our secret, and went back to work. The next day, she left a small toy car on the table near his usual spot. Nothing expensive, just something she'd found at a bodega near her apartment. Victor picked it up and turned it over in his hands like it was made of gold. When Grace walked past an hour later, he held it up to show her, and this time his smile was real. After that, it became a game. Grace would leave small things, a smooth stone, a origami crane she'd learned to fold from a YouTube video, a marble that caught the light. Victor started leaving things for her too, drawings mostly, a stick figure woman with a cleaning cart, a heart made of crayon. Once a careful sketch of Grace's face that was so accurate it made her chest ache. They developed a language without words. Victor would point at his eye, then at her. I see you. Grace would tap her heart, then point at him. I care. Simple gestures that said everything the silence wouldn't allow. He taught her some real sign language too, spelling out words with his fingers. His name. Her name. Thank you. Friend. Grace knew she was breaking every rule, knew she was risking everything, the job, David's medical bills, her entire fragile life. But when Victor smiled at her, when his hand dropped away from his ear for just a few minutes because he was focused on showing her something, she couldn't bring herself to stop. She told herself she was just being kind, that kindness wasn't the same as interference. She was wrong about that too. The breakdown happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Grace had knelt down to help with that first puzzle. She was cleaning the conservatory windows when she heard it. Not a sound exactly, because Victor couldn't make the sounds other children made when they cried, but a desperate, hitching breath that carried through the open door to the garden. She found him collapsed on the stone pathway near the roses, both hands pressed against his right ear now, his small body curled into itself. His face was streaked with silent tears, his mouth open in what should have been a scream, but came out as nothing, just air and anguish. Grace looked back at the house. The glass walls reflected nothing but sky. Mrs. Brennan was in town running errands. The nurse had Wednesdays off. No, Tuesdays. Today. The nurse had Tuesdays off. They were alone. She dropped to her knees beside him. Victor, Victor, let me see. He was trembling, his whole body locked around the pain. Grace gently pulled his hands away from his ear, and he didn't fight her. Maybe he was too exhausted. Maybe he'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to finally look. The garden was flooded with afternoon sunlight, the kind of clear, direct light that made everything sharp and honest. Grace tilted Victor's head slightly, peering into his ear canal. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the pink tunnel of flesh that every ear had. But then Victor shifted, and the angle changed, and the light hit differently. There, deep inside, something that shouldn't be there. It was dark, dense. Not the smooth architecture of bone and tissue, but something foreign, something lodged. Grace squinted, her heart beginning to hammer. She'd cleaned enough hospital rooms during her stint at Mount Sinai to recognize the difference between what belonged in a body and what didn't. This was a blockage, a mass, something physical taking up space where space shouldn't be occupied. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, Victor." She looked at his face. 8 years old, 8 years of pain, 8 years of silence that maybe wasn't congenital at all, but caused by whatever that thing was, pressing against his eardrum, blocking sound and causing constant, grinding pressure. 8 years of specialists who'd looked at scans and genetic tests and never bothered to check if something was simply stuck. Victor was watching her with those huge, dark eyes. Elena's eyes, though Grace didn't know that. And in them she saw a question he'd probably been asking his whole life. "Can you help me? Will you?" Grace's hands were shaking. She was a maid. She had no medical training, no authority, no right to be holding this child in a garden while the sun showed her what millions of dollars in specialists had missed. If she was wrong, if she acted on this and it destroyed everything, David would lose his care. She'd lose everything she'd been fighting for. But if she was right and did nothing, Victor would spend the rest of his life in pain that could have been stopped. She made her choice in the space between heartbeats. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat at David's bedside in the rehabilitation center, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, counting the rhythm of the ventilator that kept him breathing. $4,000 a month. That's what his care cost, even with the insurance she'd fought for. $4,000 she barely scraped together by working 70-hour weeks and eating one meal a day. If she lost the cross job, David would lose this room, this care, everything. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Brennan. "Tomorrow, 6:50 a.m. Main foyer needs deep cleaning. Mr. Cross has investors visiting." Grace stared at the message until the screen went dark. Then she looked back at her brother, 23 years old, his whole life reduced to this bed, this room, this endless waiting. The drunk driver who'd hit him got 6 months. David got forever. She'd been cleaning an office building when the hospital called. She remembered running 12 blocks because she couldn't afford a cab, remembered arriving breathless and terrified to find doctors who spoke in careful, clinical tones about spinal damage and limited mobility and managing expectations. She remembered wanting to scream at them. "He's a person, not an expectation to be managed." But she hadn't screamed. She'd nodded and thanked them and asked what it would cost. Everything, it turned out. It always cost everything. Grace pulled out her rosary, her mother's rosary, the one thing she'd brought from Lagos that still felt like home. She didn't go to church anymore, hadn't since Elena, since she'd started working for people who had everything and still weren't happy. But she believed in something, had to believe in something, or what was the point of any of this? "Mary, Mother of God," she whispered, the familiar prayer rising like muscle memory. "I don't know what to do. If I help him, I lose everything. If I don't help him, I lose myself." David stirred slightly, and Grace reached for his hand. His fingers twitched in response, one of the few movements he had left. The doctors said he'd never walk again. They'd been right about that, but they'd also said he'd never regain feeling in his hands. And here he was, squeezing back. Sometimes doctors were wrong. Sometimes they missed things. Victor's face flashed through her mind, that grimace of pain, those silent tears, that dark mass lodged where it shouldn't be. 8 years. He'd suffered for 8 years while experts looked at screens instead of actually looking at him. Grace thought about her own mother, who died when Grace was 12. Breast cancer that went undiagnosed for too long because the clinic in their neighborhood didn't have the right equipment, and her mother couldn't afford to go anywhere else. Grace remembered her mother's last words, whispered in Yoruba. "When you see suffering, you stop it. That's what makes us human." She'd been too young to save her mother, too poor to get David better care before the accident left him broken. But Victor, she could help. Right now, today, if she was brave enough to risk everything she'd been holding on to. Grace pressed the rosary to her lips and made her decision. Grace brought the tweezers from home. Medical-grade stainless steel. She'd bought them from a pharmacy supply store during her lunch break, along with rubbing alcohol, cotton swabs, and a penlight. She'd boiled the tweezers for 20 minutes that morning, her hands shaking so badly she'd nearly dropped them twice. This was insane. This was beyond insane. She could rupture his eardrum, cause an infection, damage him in ways that couldn't be undone. But doing nothing was damage too. 8 years of it. She found Victor in the playroom on Thursday afternoon, curled in the corner with his knees pulled to his chest, rocking slightly. His right hand was pressed so hard against his ear that his knuckles had gone white. When he saw Grace, his face crumpled with relief and desperation, a look that said, "Please, please make it stop." Grace's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She glanced at the hallway. Mrs. Brennan was supervising the groundskeepers. Damian was in Manhattan, wouldn't be back until evening. The nurse was doing inventory in the medical supply room on the first floor. Now or never. She knelt beside Victor and pulled out her phone, typing quickly, "I think I can help, but I need you to be very, very still. Can you do that for me?" Victor read the message and nodded, his eyes huge and trusting in a way that made Grace want to weep. She led him to the window where the light was strongest, positioned him so the afternoon sun flooded directly into his ear canal. With trembling fingers, she pulled on the latex gloves she'd bought, then used a cotton swab dipped in alcohol to clean around his ear. Victor winced but didn't pull away. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Okay, Mary, Mother of God, guide my hand." She clicked on the penlight, angled it into his ear and peered inside. There it was, that dark, dense mass, maybe 5 millimeters deep, close enough to see, close enough maybe to reach. Grace picked up the tweezers. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to pause, breathe, steady herself. She thought of David. She thought of her mother. She thought of every time someone had looked at suffering and decided it wasn't their problem. She inserted the tweezers slowly, carefully, following the angle of Victor's ear canal. Victor's whole body went rigid, but he held still like she'd asked. Grace could feel resistance. Whatever it was had been there a long time, pressed tight against tissue that had swollen around it. "Almost there," she breathed. "Almost." The tweezers caught something solid. She adjusted her grip, applied gentle, steady pressure, and pulled. It came out all at once, a small, dark object clutched in the tweezer's grip. Grace held it up to the light, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. A bead. A small, round bead, the kind that came from those educational toys for toddlers, aged and compressed from years of being lodged in warm, damp flesh. For a moment, nothing happened. Victor sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes unfocused. Then his head snapped toward the window. His eyes went wide. His hand flew up, not to his ear this time, but out, pointing at the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Victor's face transformed. Confusion gave way to wonder, then to something Grace had never seen on him before. Pure, radiant joy. His mouth opened and a sound came out, rough and unpracticed, but unmistakably a sound. A laugh, a sob, both at once. He could hear. Damian wasn't supposed to be home until 7. The board meeting had been scheduled to run until 6:30, then dinner with investors at 8. But his assistant had mentioned something about Victor seeming unwell that morning, and the comment had lodged in Damian's mind like a splinter. He'd excused himself early, ignored the irritated looks from the board members, and driven back to Westchester doing 70 in a 55 zone. He walked through the front door at 4:47 and heard something he hadn't heard in 8 years. His son's voice. Not words, Victor didn't know words yet, didn't know how to shape his mouth around sounds he'd never heard. But it was unmistakably a voice, high and uncertain, and making noise after noise like he was testing a new instrument. Damian's briefcase hit the floor. He ran toward the playroom, his heart in his throat, hope and terror colliding in his chest. What he saw stopped him cold. Victor was sitting by the window, his head tilted at an odd angle. Grace, the new maid, the one Mrs. Brennan had hired last month, was kneeling beside him, medical gloves on her hands, a pair of tweezers in her grip. There was blood on the cotton swabs scattered on the floor, blood on Victor's ear. And Victor was making sounds, strange sounds, his face contorted in what looked like confusion, or pain, or, "Get away from him!" Damian's roar shattered the silence like a gunshot. Grace's head jerked up, her eyes wide with shock. She started to stand, started to speak, but Damian was already moving. He shoved her aside, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to send her stumbling backward, and gathered Victor into his arms. "What did you do?" His voice was shaking, somewhere between fury and panic. "What the hell did you do to my son?" Victor was making more sounds now, reaching for Grace, his expression not frightened but excited, trying to tell his father something in the sign language Damian had never bothered to learn properly, because what was the point? What was the goddamn point when nothing would ever change? "Security!" Damian bellowed. "Security, get up here now!" Grace had found her voice. "Mr. Cross, please, if you just let me explain." "Explain what? That you assaulted my child? That you performed some kind of—" He looked at the tweezers, the blood, the medical supplies spread across the floor like evidence at a crime scene. "Jesus Christ, did you try to operate on him? Are you insane?" "There was a blockage," Grace said, her voice desperate but steady. "A bead, lodged in his ear canal for years. I removed it. Mr. Cross, he can hear—" "He's deaf!" Damian roared, and Victor flinched in his arms at the volume. And that should have told Damian everything, but he was too far gone in rage and fear to notice. "He was born deaf, you delusional—" Two security guards burst through the door. Marcus and James, both former military, both trained to respond to threats with overwhelming force. "Detain her," Damian ordered. "Call the police, and get Dr. Morrison on the phone. Tell him we're coming in. Possible ear trauma. Possible assault." "Mr. Cross, please." Grace's voice cracked as Marcus grabbed her arm. "Just look at him. Look at your son." But Damian wasn't looking. He was already moving toward the door, Victor clutched against his chest, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. Infection, damage, permanent harm done by some uneducated woman who decided she knew better than every specialist in the world. He didn't see Victor twisting in his arms, trying to look back at Grace. Didn't hear, couldn't hear, would never hear, his son trying to make the shape of a word with his unpracticed mouth. A word that sounded almost like no. Dr. Elizabeth Matthews had been Victor's pediatrician since birth, one of the few medical professionals Damian still trusted after years of consultations that led nowhere. She met them in the emergency room at Mount Sinai, took one look at Victor's animated face and the way his head kept turning toward every ambient sound, and knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. The examination took 20 minutes. Matthews checked Victor's ear canal with an otoscope, ran a basic hearing test, then pulled up his medical files on her tablet. Damian watched her face shift from professional concern to something darker. Disgust, maybe, or rage carefully controlled. "Mr. Cross," she said quietly, "I need you to look at something." She turned the tablet toward him. On the screen was a CT scan from 3 years ago, ordered by a specialist in Berlin. Dr. Klaus Reinhardt, one of the most respected otolaryngologists in Europe. Damian had paid $40,000 for that consultation. Matthew zoomed in on a specific area of the image, her finger tapping the screen. "Do you see this? This shadow in the ear canal?" Damian squinted. There was something there, a dark spot he'd never noticed before. "What is it?" "A foreign object. A bead based on what you've described the maid removing. It's been visible on every scan Victor's had since he was 3 years old." Matthews's voice was clinical, but her jaw was tight. Dr. Reinhardt saw it. So did Dr. Patel in Singapore, and Dr. Morrison at Mayo. Every single specialist you consulted knew there was a physical blockage. The words didn't make sense. Damian shook his head. "That's impossible. They all said it was congenital. They said nothing could be done." "Because a congenital condition requires ongoing management, consultations, experimental treatments, research grants." Matthews set the tablet down, and when she looked at Damian, her eyes were filled with something like pity. "A bead removal is a 15-minute outpatient procedure that costs $300. Which one do you think they'd rather bill you for?" The room tilted. Damian grabbed the edge of the examination table, his billion-dollar mind struggling to process what she was telling him. "They knew. They all knew, and they milked you," Matthews finished bluntly. "Mr. Cross, you're one of the richest men in the country. To them, you weren't a father seeking help. You were a revenue stream." Damian looked at Victor, who was signing excitedly to the nurse, his hands moving in quick, joyful gestures, while his mouth formed sounds he was learning to control. 8 years. 8 years of silence, of pain, of isolation, not because nothing could be done, but because doing something wouldn't have been profitable enough. "The maid," Damian whispered. "Grace, where is she?" "Probably in police custody by now, if your security followed through." Damian was already running. He found Grace in the estate's security office, still detained, her face composed but her eyes red-rimmed. When she saw him, she stood up straighter, dignity wrapped around her like armor, even though she'd lost everything. Damian Cross, who had negotiated with presidents and intimidated Fortune 500 CEOs, dropped to his knees in front of a maid from Queens. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "Please, forgive me." Grace stared at him, this powerful man kneeling on the floor of his own security office, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for weeks finally loosened. "Get up, Mr. Cross, please. You saved my son. You risked everything, and I—" He couldn't finish, couldn't articulate the magnitude of his failure, his blindness, his willingness to believe expensive lies over simple truth. Grace knelt down so they were eye level. "He can hear now. That's what matters." 3 months later, Victor was speaking. Simple words at first, shaped carefully with the help of a speech therapist who actually wanted to help rather than bill. "Dad, Grace, music." That last one was his favorite. Damian had bought him headphones, a record player, every instrument a child could want. The house was no longer silent. It was full of sound. Victor's laughter, his questions, his off-key attempts at singing. Grace still worked at the estate, but not as a maid. Damian had hired her as Victor's companion, tripled her salary, and paid off David's medical bills in full. She'd tried to refuse the charity, but Damian had insisted it wasn't charity. It was a debt he could never fully repay. On Victor's 9th birthday, Damian found his son in the living room, lying with his head pressed against his father's chest, eyes closed in concentration. What are you listening to? Damian asked. Victor smiled, that same smile that looks so much like Elena's. Your heartbeat, it sounds like home. And Damian Cross, who had spent 8 years surrounded by silence, finally understood what it meant to hear.